The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on modern regression testing across platforms. I'm Christina Cardoza, news editor of SD Times. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, we will be conducting a live Q&A after today's presentation. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, you may submit your questions through the control panel's question tab. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and available on demand through the sdtimes.com website in about 24 hours after the event. Here at SD Times, we've been writing about how testing needs to catch up to the pace of today's modern way of working. Development cycles are getting shorter, changes are happening faster, and testing earlier and often is becoming essential. Today's webinar will focus on regression testing, how to shorten the cycle from days to hours and test in the real world across a broad range of devices. Here to discuss this further is Philip Zoffer, CEO of Testio, and Fernando Gonzalez, Software Test Team Leader for UITV. To get things started, I will throw it over to you, Fernando.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'll go really quickly through our agenda about the things that we're going to talk about today. Before I do that, just a little bit about myself. My name is Fernando Gonzalez. I'm the software tester lead at UITV and also a product manager here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about UITV and what the regression testing challenges were in our multi-platform environment, how crowdsourced testings help us solve those issues, and just a couple of tips and tricks about how you can get the most out of crowd testing if you're looking into it yourself. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll pass it over to Phil, where he's going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek behind the scenes, what happens at Testio when you submit a test to the crowd. So if you're here, you're probably here because you're either curious about crowdsourced testing or you have an issue with regression testing yourself. So this was also the catalyst for us to kind of embark in this bit of an adventure, which is testing through the crowd. It was what I call the regression testing bottleneck. Our testers here at UI, they work very closely with our developers from the beginning of the developmental cycle. We don't really have testing as a phase at the end, but they're always involved from the very beginning. And using the agile model, we submit. We want to keep a release quality build at all times of the developmental cycle. So once a sprint, we'll send the bill out to the customer. Before we do that, though, we're performing these huge regression sweeps, and they were very expensive. They take 2 to 3 days, and this is for a team of 2 to 3 testers, so it could be anywhere between 4 to 6 people days, and everybody was in panic mode because the bill's going out to the customer, and we had all these platforms that we support, and we had to do this regression testing. And so the team kind of stop doing anything because we're going to do regression testing for the next 6 days. And then when that was over, then our testers were really behind and they had to play catch up with the team. So they were very expensive, very little return on the investment there. We weren't actually finding anything of value, certainly nothing critical. It was more of a checkbox in somebody's list. So and again, all the sheer number of devices that we needed for this, it was kind of panicky. And it really slowed down our product development. It really had an impact on our overall delivery because of the constant catch-up. The testers were squished at the end of the sprint, having to do this, and then playing catch-up for the rest of the following sprint. So if this kind of rings a bell, then to your organization, or if you're curious about what we did, then stick around. This is basically what we're going to be chatting about today. So a little background about UITV. We make TV streaming apps for across multiple platforms, anywhere from mobile devices, iOS, Android, to gaming consoles, and Roku, Xbox, PlayStation, set-top boxes, basically anything. We do have a product called the UI Engine, which you can use to make your own apps, and we also have a services side of the organization when we make apps for other brands. And those are the logos you see at the bottom of this slide. Cartoon Network, Chorus, we made a Nickelodeon and a White TV app for them. NBA, Fox, Disney, National Geographic. Well, if you go to our website, you'll see a bunch of those household type of logos that we've worked with. So our UI Engine 1, that's our product. It's kind of this magical product because it's a single code base that just magically works everywhere. And typically, if you were to make an app for iOS and for Android and for Xbox, you usually would have 3 or 4 different code bases depending on the platform. You have to code everything 3 times, or they look a little bit different too. But the UI engine one, sometimes actually different companies that'll do it, or different teams. The engine one allows the developers to just code it once and it just magically appears everywhere. It's very integrated with After Effects, so it gives the designers too a very active role in on development cycle. And again, following the agile method, we try to keep a release quality, shippable product at all times of the development cycle, and then every sprint, and sometimes more often than that, we'll deliver a quality build to the customer. So that product and that kind of release cadence manifested itself with some testing challenges, because even though you code it once and it appears everywhere, you still have to test it everywhere, don't you? You still have to make sure that it works in the tablets and in the handsets and in Android and in Xbox and in PlayStation. So our testers or developers and our designers only had to do it once, but our testers still had to do all that testing for all those devices. Also, we're a global company, so we have we have apps that are in the market in the North America, and some in South America, some in Asia Pacific, some in Europe. So, but our testers, internal testers, mostly based out of Canada, or the US, they had to use some kind of VPN software to fake their location. So that also added its own set of challenges, especially during regression sweeps where time was so constrained. I mean, the workload was so high. And again, our testing philosophy was that we didn't want any known gating issues on the build at any time. We're very protective of our build. We test all the code from the beginning, the implementation, only when we've addressed all the bugs that we found, then we merge it into the code. So by doing all these regression sweeps at the end, we weren't really finding anything. But again, we had to do it. So what did we do about it? Well, we had a couple options. One option was like, how about we don't do it anymore? How about we stop doing regression testing if we don't bring any value? But I kind of had the hunch that it wasn't that there weren't any bugs, it's that we weren't finding them, because again, these are the same testers that were using the same devices that were performing these kind of mini regression testings many times throughout the cycle, every time a story gets merged. So of course, they're not finding a whole lot of bugs at the end of the sprint, because they've already tested that on the same devices, the same environments. They were beefing up. Automation came up, and yeah, for sure, that's a good complement to manual testing, but certainly not a replacement. We threw around some ideas of an internal beta program. Maybe we can have some of our other employees do the testing for us. And then again, the solution that most people come to when they think of a resourcing issue internally, how about we just outsource regression testing? Let's get somebody else to do it. But that, I didn't think that was going to solve any problems, because when you outsource your work, you still have a whole set of testers that are in the same building with the same devices. Sometimes we'd have to ship them devices because they might not have the devices that we need. And they might find some stuff at the beginning, but then, again, they're going to run into the same problems we did. They're not going to find a whole lot of stuff under the same devices, same testers, same building, same environment. So then we kind of stumble upon crowd testing, and it was very appealing. For sure, the main appeal was the fact that it's a real world type of testing. These are real people with real dirty devices, like not or internal devices, and outsourced devices are typically very clean. They only have the app that we're testing on it, but the real world testing, then you find coexistence with all sorts of apps, and these are real users all around the globe, different network conditions, different service providers, very weird devices that we didn't even know existed. It was affordable, so it's actually, when we looked at outsourced versus crowdsourced testing, we found that the crowd testing was more affordable, especially when you take into account that we don't have to purchase all these devices. It's a global service, so again, currently we're developing an app for a client in the Nordic countries, like in Denmark and Finland, and we and Testio put together a custom crowd of testers that are actually living there, so that's we don't have to deal with VPN issues. Kind of fresh eyes is certainly something that was very appealing to me. Personally, I've been a tester for over 10 years, and if you're a tester yourself, you know that you kind of develop, after playing with the same app over and over again, you develop a bit of a tester blindness when something could be run right in front of your face and you don't see it because you just kind of can't see the forest through the trees. So the fact that every time we send a build to the crowd, somebody else new is looking at it, it was kind of very comforting. And then scalability, which is something we're still working on it, but being a services organization, this is certainly important to us, the fact that we can engage more people when we're busy and drop off offload some people when we're not. We had some concerns going into them, and I'm just going to skim through them, but they've mostly been all addressed before we went in. But NDA, you know, and deployment, how are we going to get the build to all these people? Are they actually using devices, or are they using simulator? What kind of documentation do we need for this? That was important to us because at UI, we don't really write those traditionally overly detailed test cases that you get from other corporations. We're very big believers of exploratory testing and high-level documentation. So if this investment required us to start writing these overly detailed test cases, then it wasn't going to work for us. Authentication and also the administrative overhead. How much are we going to spend creating these tests and dealing with the crowd, especially if they're sending like hundreds of bugs and some of them are not valuable to us? What kind of overhead we're looking at here? So those were kind of our concerns going into that. So we did a little research, and then we went with Testio. We actually interviewed 5 different crowdsourced testing companies, and the reason why we selected Testio was real people, real devices that were using, again, not simulators. But really one of the biggest catalysts for choosing Testio was their subscription model. So basically you pay one flat fee and you can use the service as much as you want. You can send as many tests as you want within a month. And that was really important to us. I told my team, like, whatever solution we go to, we have to know that we're going to fail at first, and that's okay. Just like any new technology that you bring in or any new process that you bring to your organization, it's always an iterative approach. You do it first, and then you keep doing it and get better at it. You learn how to make it work for you better, and then and just not be afraid of failure until it works for you. But we were afraid that if we were in any kind of payment plan that would penalize us for trying and for failing, such as having something like, you know, pay per hour or per tester or per test sent, that wasn't going to work for us, because then we'd be afraid to try it out and we'd never get better at it. And this is true of any kind of new technology that you adopt. You want to minimize that cost of failure as much as possible. They had a test lead service. They have a test lead service, which is really important to us. Basically somebody who looks at all the bugs that the crowd logs, and they triage them before they even come to us and make sure they're clean, that they have logs, that they're reproducible. So again, minimizing the overhead that we were worried about. And of course, there's the sheer number of testers they have, and how they pay the testers was really well thought out, and how they support exploratory and test case testing. So this is how we use Testio in our organization. Basically, every project that uses Testio, every build that we send the client, we send it to the crowd first. This typically happens once per sprint, or maybe more if there's any risky code or any like big features get merged in. We typically don't do any focused testing. We do a full app regression testing, which was what we were trying to tackle to begin with. So basically, we send the instructions. This is what our app looks like, and those instructions grow as our apps grow, and just go to town. This is what's changed, and just these are all the app sections in the app and how they're supposed to look. Just go to town, see what you find. Full app regression testing. What's cool about it, though, is that any bug that gets approved brings from the crowd, internally, they're just treated the same as any bug that our internal testers raise. They get prioritized with the customer, and they're visible across the company through Slack, just the same as any other bug. But what's most important is that it's really freed up our testers to join the new sprint. So instead of having that panic moment, they go to the crowd, and then they move on to the next sprint side to side with the developers, and then the bugs start coming in as they focus on their other work. So this is an interesting graphic, and it ties back to the scalability point that I made earlier. This is basically how many products we've been using the crowd with and how often we send the tests. And I think it's very representative of a service organization. You kind of have your peaks and valleys throughout the year. Sometimes you get busier, sometimes you have more projects on the go. So you can see here in October and November, we had a busy time and then kind of slow down in December. So we really wanted a solution that would match that need. So how did they work? Well, I mean, we set ourselves a goal, which is we're spending 4 to 6 people days. I want to reduce that to half a person day. And that's what we've achieved. So in fact, all of the projects at UI that use Testio currently have completely crowdsourced their regression testing. So we only spend about half a person day, sometimes even less, just sending the build and reviewing the bugs that come back, if any come back. And so yeah, yay. So basically we've been successfully cut down our regression testing time by 80% on the projects that use it. So if you're curious about using this on your organization, these are some kind of tips and tricks of how to get the most out of crowdsourced testing, some of the lessons we learned doing this. The first one, I talked about it earlier, is just to test and then test again, not being afraid of failure. Like any new process, you have to try it, and you kind of learn to engage the crowd to how to tune those tests so that you, when it's too much information, so that people will just skim over it. When it's too little, that you don't really get them excited, and then at some point you kind of hit a sweet spot where the tests that you're sending have just minimize your overhead completely, because you know what, you can just send that over and over again. You're gonna get good quality bugs, the bugs that you want. So you develop a bit of a spidey sense as to how to engage with the crowd, and you know, sometimes you need to put some information here, sometimes not, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. You might really maximize the value of the service. Something else I've learned is that you can actually ask for more of the crowd. When we initially engaged with Testio, I was treating the testers more of like a user-centric type of testing. You know, this is how our users would use our apps. But actually, these are actually quite qualified testers, and you can ask them for more. So you can send them a visual design document and say, can you identify what doesn't match? Do a visual review and see what doesn't match our visuals, or here are some instructions as to how to install Charles proxy, and you can point your device to your proxy and capture some network traffic and send it to us. Again, these are not things you typically get out of a user or even a beta tester or a beta program. You get it out of a more qualified tester. But ultimately, the main takeaway that I learned with this is, like anything, you first make it work, and then you work on making it easier. So at first, when we first implemented it, we immediately saw the value. Like, this was cutting, especially with like this kind of new technologies, emerging technologies. We saw the value. It was really a attractive offering. So we saw the value, and it might have been a little bit clunky at first, and now we're working on making it easier, making it more integrated into our process, and also to engage our internal testers to play with it more and use it more and more. So again, if you're interested in doing this yourself, these are some of the metrics that we use to measure success, how successful we were. Rejection rate is a good one. Basically, how many bugs from the crowd you reject. This is a number certainly you want to keep low. And this metrics paint a little bit of a different picture from project to project, even in our own organization. So it's important to keep track of them, just to see what are some projects doing better that you can learn from the other one. And then the bugs that actually do get accepted, what kind of path do they have? How many out of the bugs that we got logged, how many we accepted, how many we imported into Jira, and how many of them got fixed? How long did it take to fix it, and what's the priority that the customer gave them? That's the money for me. Like, the bugs that got fixed and got fixed quickly or with high priority, those are the ones that made a big impact on our project, and they came from the crowd. Another metric that's kind of on the other side of that, that's a little bit harder to get, is how many bugs did we log that the crowd missed? So that one's a little trickier to do, because of course our internal testers get access to the build all the time. The crowd only gets them when we send them the test. So, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And how management overhead. We talked about this earlier as well. How long is it taking out of our time to create this test and get and go through the bugs? Again, this is a very successful metric for us. We want our regression testing from 4 to 6 days to half a person day. And then what kind of engagement are you getting out of the crowd? How often are you sending them build? How many testers are they picking it up? And what kind of how many devices do they use? This is an interesting graphic here of the sheer number of devices. I'm not sure if this is for a single project or even for a single test is possible, but you can see here the sheer number of devices that get picked up by the crowd. And if we were going to do this regression testing internally, we'd never be able to hit this sheer number of devices. Certainly not with 2 testers over 3 days. If anything, would focus maybe on 4 or 6, maybe like 2, one per screen form factor per platform. But so this is a good representation of number of devices. Some of these devices I've never even heard of, like a cell phone or Redmi. So what's next? So again, working on making it easier. Now we're working on what we can do to bring this even a little bit further, and how we can improve what are the areas of improvement in our current engagement. Well, expanding the platform support, it's a big one. So when we first engaged with Testio, they mostly were focusing on web, iOS, and Android devices. But since we've talked to them over the last year, they've added a lot of the platforms that are important to us, such as tvOS, Roku, and consoles, Xbox and PlayStation. So we're continuously to expand that platform support. The workflow integration with Jira, again, that's something that when we first joined Testio, it was more of a one-way integration. So you use their platform and to review the bugs, and you click a button and the bug just magically appears on your Jira. But some of our projects are now on a more customized solution where we can create the test right from Jira, and the bugs come right from Jira, so you never actually have to leave Jira to use to send builds to the crowd. And that's something that I think it gets our internal testers very excited, because then they get to do it right from Jira. And in fact, in the future, I'd like to see even a more close integration where we can not just send the build, but we can send a single story or a bug to the crowd. I'm curious about what it would look like if we had crowd testing as a status of our items. So we can, it goes from open to do, to doing, to test, to crowd test. So you can send all of our stories and all of our bugs to crowd testing. We're still working on getting some better metrics. Currently, Testio provides us some metrics of like how many testers pick up the test and how many devices bugs get logged on. But I'd like to learn a little bit more how long were the testers actually playing with the app. Did they actually hit everything, or did they focus on a single one? So we're working on better metrics. And again, this is an initiative that actually Testio brought to us. They noticed that some of the projects was more successful than others, and there's like, hey, let's look at the ones that have a higher regression rate and rejection rate and see what we can do to make it more successful. So that they've offered to do an audit of some of our projects. So yeah, so far, again, the value has been great. It's always very exciting to be in kind of the cutting edge of a new technology, and especially when you see value, and that's so far it's been great. And I'll pass it over to Phil now, and he can talk to you a little bit about what happens behind the scenes when you do send a test to the crowd.
All right, so Fernando, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I think one reason you get such great results with Testio is that you're just doing a lot of things right. And I think that helps. And I particularly like what you said about being willing to do an experiment and fail and then try again. Because if there's one thing that I would want to tell anybody who is thinking of working with crowd testing, it's that human beings are marvelously adaptable, and that we can tune the results that you get from the crowd to correspond with your needs. So that's maybe the key point of my behind the scenes look at Testio, is just to give you a little insight into what actually happens when you order a test. So Fernando types in his description and selects the devices that he wants, and then what actually happens. Well, the first thing that happens is we find a team leader for that test. And the team leader has a couple of important functions right away. First of all, validating that test environment to make sure that what is there can actually be tested. And then secondly, validating or even improving the test instructions. So when you have a guy like Fernando, who's an old pro at how to manage the crowd, he writes very good and clear instructions, but sometimes we'll get tests where the instructions need to be modified in order to be useful for the crowd. So the team leader helps with that even before reviewing any of the bugs. The second thing that we do is we identify a pool of testers, and it's a sort of common misconception that, okay, there's 40,000 testers in the crowd, that means 40,000 people are going to be beating on my app. Oh my goodness. And that's actually not how it works. What we try to do with the assignment algorithm is we try to find the right mix of people for each test. And that's some combination of what devices do they have, because different tests have different coverage requirements. What languages do they speak and read, I guess more importantly, and how experienced are they, not just as testers, but with your app. So in the case of Fernando and the apps that UITV develops, they're very consumer oriented. And Fernando has already identified that having people who are too familiar with their apps actually can be a negative indicator. There are some apps that are perhaps more complicated where prior familiarity with the app is actually more of a positive indicator. So we try to do what we can to, I guess, sculpt the crowd into the right group of people, right segment of people for any given test. Then the test executes. And what's really important is that we try to get the right bugs to you as part of that test. So one thing that I often say to a new customer is the easiest thing that we could possibly do is just take anything that looks like it might be a bug and throw it at you. And we don't want to do that. We actually want to scope down the number of bugs that we present because there's a lot of things that come back that are marginal. There's a lot of things that come back that maybe you wouldn't care about. There's a lot of things that might be hard to reproduce, or even Heisenbugs that are not reproducible at all, or there's all kinds of things that can happen. So what we try to do is implement some combination of sort of human quality control, machine quality control, and then reproduction of the bugs. And then finally, there's actually a team leader who validates all of those bugs before you get your results. And so what we give you is the best possible understanding that we have of what you would want. So what you want actually differs in different kinds of use cases. And this is the second and last sort of that people sometimes have about crowd testing. It's not one kind of test for one kind of customer. There's actually 4 different types of tests that we specialize in. One is what we call a rapid test. It's kind of self-explanatory. Results come back really fast, and we're only showing you the most critical things or the most obviously bad things. And these are often used in a couple of different use cases, one of which is maybe surprising to you. The first and least surprising is it's kind of a sanity test that you can do before you merge in a piece of code after a pull request that says, okay, I passed all its automated tests, I looked at it, I got some other eyes on it too, and it's fine. But the second one is actually kind of interesting. We have a number of customers who push their code to production. It's part of their pipeline to just push, push, push. And they want the first people to see it, sometimes pinned behind a feature flag, to be our testers. And why our testers? Because our testers are going to give you really good bug reports with screenshots and explicit steps to reproduce. If your customer saw it, it wouldn't be quite so clean. So this rapid test is often something that's actually done in production. Second type of test is this coverage test, and that's where we're maximizing for device diversity. And this is particularly important in a couple areas. One is companies like UITV or like a Headspace that is doing a global rollout, and so they don't want to have their customers in the developing world exposed necessarily to an app that's only been tested on an iPhone 10 or whatever the developers have around the shop. A second really important use case for this is e-commerce purchase flows. You'd be shocked at how many times things like the purchase button is obscured in a form factor that you didn't see. Fernando alluded to a focus test. That's a test that is the sort of shakeout of, I've got this new product or new feature and I want to make sure I know everything that is going on there. And so in that case, what we will do is we will kind of turn the bug spigot open and maybe give you more bugs than we might in one of these other tests, because you'll want to make sure that there's not some unforeseen consequence. And finally, we can also optimize tests, as Fernando alluded, for usability feedback. You can think of it as kind of a hallway test, but with more people and with a little bit more demographic profiling than you can get in a typical development team's hallway. So that's kind of the breakdown of the tests that Testio offers and the use cases that we find for them. You can also do a sort of custom test that allows you to set all the variables. But I thought that this would be helpful in sort of breaking down this concept of crowd testing as, okay, well, it's just a lot of people hitting the app, to something that's a little bit more specific and approachable in your everyday life. And with that, I'm just going to ask one quick question of the audience, which is basically, do you want to learn more about Testio? And if you do, and you select yes, that'll help us with any of the follow-up that happens from this. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to do those responses, and then once we've got I guess over 75% of people voting, maybe we can do that. Actually, we're sort of at US election voting levels of 55%. Wonder if we'll do better. Then we'll push on to the Q&A. All right, we're at 60% have voted. 65. All right, almost at 70. One more vote. Well, let's do it. Okay, awesome. So now I will close the poll, and we can move on. So we should be moving on to the Q&A. I just need to get back to the right screen there. Okay, so now I'd like to open it up to Q&A, and I think this Q&A is moderated through the question panel that you can type things. You can type your questions in, and they'll be selected by our moderators. So please feel free, and Christina, let us know what questions you want Fernando or me to answer.
Great, thanks, Phil. We have a couple of questions coming in. So I think this one might be for you, Phil. So for people who are accustomed to writing out conventional test cases, tell us how working with Testio's crowd tester is different.
Well, that's a good question, and maybe a better question for Fernando. But I think what I would say is that at Testio, in working with the crowd, you want to hit that sweet spot. You don't want to tell them, you know, first type in http:// blah, blah into your web browser, and then every single step. Because if you're doing that, you may as well automate it anyway. So you kind of want to hit that spot where you're giving them enough guidance that you know what you're looking for, but not so much guidance that they are walking down only the happy path. And so it's something that our customer success managers help our new customers with, sort of the onboarding phase of an engagement with Testio. A lot of it is about tuning your test instructions to maximize the output that you're going to get from the crowd.
Yeah, and if I was to add anything to that, the way I look at it, it's a bit of a shopping list so the instructions we write typically go about what to test, not specifically how to test it. And this might vary with whatever software you're using for sure. If it's more a consumer-friendly software, people really kind of figure things out. But basically, it's more of a I like to think of it as a shopping list. When you make a shopping list, I need to get, I don't know, bread, milk, and tomatoes. You don't specifically say, step one, go to the bread aisle, remove that. No, it's just, you know what I mean? It's more of a what to do, not necessarily how. It's every step. Keep it at high level enough that they will actually read it, and but also just give them as much information as they need, but no more.
Great. So Fernando, did you find ITV was spending a lot of time having to prepare scenario documentation for the crowd tester?
No. So again, UI, we don't write those test cases like that. Typically, like very detailed test cases, our documentation is very high level. So the documentation that we were using here, it was basically just need a little bit of tweaking. So, especially around some terminology that might be, only known internally. And just instead of like single words for a whole test, maybe we put a single sentence just to make it more clear. But no, the documentation that we had internally it was very useful starting point. And again, the more you use it, then you tune out, you learn what information you need to put in. And so I'd say at this point, for example, I sent 4 tests yesterday for one of our projects. It took me 3 minutes. Because the documentation was mostly already there. I just have to, what changes went into the last build. I just put a couple things here and there, and then I just send the build. So I'd say out of that half a day that we were talking about in terms of that mean time that we reduce, it's mostly the bugs coming in, just looking at them, making sure that they're in the app, and whether they're ours or one of our partners. It's good information. It's information that I would, it's time that we would spend doing the same thing with the bugs that came in with our internal testers. But the actual preparation of documentation, after you learn how to do it, it's less than 5 minutes.
Great. And how do you provide that documentation to testers so that it's internal only?
So they have, the platform, the Testio platform has, you do it through the Testio platform. So they have whenever you submit a test through their platform, and some of our projects are also doing it through Jira. So we actually, if you were coming in through to use Testio out of the box, and you use their platform, and basically you can add app sections for all the sections of your software, and just provide again some information about each app section, where to access it, and what kind of tests you need to run in it. So that's how you can provide it securely. Now, earlier I talked about a Jira integration that we're working on, and basically some of our projects are now storing our tests right in Jira, and then when we send the test to the crowd through Jira, then it gets imported into the Testio platform the same way that you would do manually, and then out to the crowd.
Great. So Fernando, can you give us an example of a bug that someone in the crowd found that your team would have been unlikely to find?
Well, I can think of many actually. Certainly the bugs that are device specific, or not necessarily. We hardly have bugs that are device specific, but certainly things that happen in like lower end devices that we might not have here, like memory leaks or crashes. And then I asked for certain projects, I'll ask, can I have at least 2 testers from the crowd reproduce the same issue before it gets to me? So then if I do that, I can see that the 2 testers that reproduced it have kind of a lower end device, and it's probably a memory issue, and we can debug here. If you want a specific example for, we found lots of bugs on the new kind of handsets that have an 18 by 9 aspect ratio. We actually didn't have one here because the project that we were working on, it didn't have support for that one yet. But most of the new handsets are coming up with that ratio, and lots of bugs come from the crowd. So it kind of gave us a head start in, oh, when we got support for 18.9, these are all the bugs we're going to have to fix.
Now, do you worry that the crowd will miss things? And if so, what do you do to reduce that risk?
That's a good question. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the metric I was talking about on miss bug. It's kind of a hard metric to get because our testers here are playing with the app all the time. So, and we provide a list of known issues with every build that we send. So the bug, the crowd is not logging the same issues that we're logging internally. So who knows, they might have found it too if we hadn't provided that list. So what do I do? I mean, yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, typically, there are still some scenarios like that we will do a full regression testing internally. Like throughout the whole sprint, we crowdsource completely, and then maybe the last build before it actually goes live into the market, just for like a double check, we'll do it both crowdsource and internally. So that's a good comparison, because then the same build is played with internally and externally and see what we find. But again, this is the same result we had before. Our internal testers are not really finding a whole lot of things at the end of the sprint. They're typically, the stuff they find happens during development. So I'd say most of the bugs of regression testing, they come up from the crowd, not internally.
Great. And how do you measure the effectiveness of this approach?
Of that particular approach, or just crowdsourced testing altogether?
Crowd in general.
Yeah, so there is that slide. I'm sure the slide deck will be shared as well with the participants, but there is a slide of specific metrics that we use to measure success. So, and Testio, it's a good partner to help you with those metrics, because so you can get some metrics out of the Testio platform directly, or you can talk to your customer success manager, and they'll provide you with some metrics about what kind of rejection rate do you have with your projects, like how many bugs are you rejecting, and they'll have insight into how many you accept and how many you bring into Jira. We have one of our testers here that did a bit of an audit across the board and created this report as to what's the bug funnel, of how many bugs are we accepting and how many of them gets imported into Jira and how many of them get fixed, and how long did it take. All of those are good metrics for it. And then again, but for me, the money comes in how much time am I spending in regression testing now versus before, and am I still getting the same quality app that we were doing before? And the answer is, again, from 4 to 6 people days to half a person day. That's a good measure of success. And the fact that we're finding bugs. No, in the last project that we used the crowds for, we did not get a single bug from UAT. So user acceptance testing, once we handed it into the crowd, that we didn't, to the client, that we didn't already know about. So that's also a good measure of success. No bugs but got brought up from our client after we actually handed out. So our quality standards are still very high. If anything, I'd argue that they're higher now because our pool of devices have increased. So I mean, also all those metrics that I put on that slide are certainly good measures, as well as just our experience, seeing that the apps are good quality and that we're spending less time on regression testing.
Great. Now, are your teams taking an agile approach? And if so, how does Testio help you with that process?
Yeah, so that actually the Testio came because of our approach to Agile, in that, again, we don't treat testing as a phase in the development process. Certainly, our developers and our testers collaborate from the beginning of the sprint and throughout the entire project. We want to be able to cut a bill at any time of the development process and have it be a shippable product. So when we were doing those regression sweeps internally, the testers were being decoupled from that process because the developers would continue working on the next sprints while the testers were working on regression testing for 2 to 3 days. So they were moving away from that agile process and falling into a bit of a mini waterfall process, because 2 or 3 days later, by the time they were done with regression testing and ready to join the team, the developers had already a lot of PRs, a lot of features basically ready for testing, and they move on to even other stuff. So they created a bit of a mini waterfall project in that the developers had stuff waiting for testers to do to kind of hand over the wall. But since we crowdsource our regression testings, our developers and our testers have been able to stay collaborating and iterate together, as opposed to on separate like different phases or different levels of a waterfall.
Great. Now, how do you envision the future of crowdsourced testing? Is this something you think will eventually replace traditional testers?
No, not necessarily. I think that testers are important with all the testing that requires collaboration with your dev team, and that kind of personal rich interaction between your testers and your developers, that you need to have that in order to have a agile, well-integrated team. That experience, that communication that happens constantly between all parties of the Scrum are important. But certainly they can be a great complement, and for sure they can decrease your need for resources. I've heard at least one product manager, no, a dev manager in one of our teams that use Agile that used the Testio, that if they didn't have Testio, they would have need another tester. So for sure they are a good complement, but you're always going to need, you always want to have a tester work with your developers internally. That communication that happens constantly, it's important, and that's harder to do in any kind of outsourced or crowdsourced or any type of external team from the core project team.
Let me add a little bit about how I think about that.
Sure.
At Testio, we never say, oh, you should replace your testers or your QA team with Testio. We like to think of ourselves much more as a force multiplier for your testers and for your team. And also, and I think this is really important, as a force that levels the playing field. Because out there in the world, there's a lot of talk about DevOps and about how you can automate all the things and how everything can be perfect through these extreme levels of automation that companies like Google or Facebook are doing. But what you don't hear when you read these stories, you don't hear, first of all, that their products receive tremendous manual testing from internal teams, and then from employees at that company who are able to do a lot of testing. And then they're released to 0.1% of user communities, which in this case is 2 million people. And then there's a lot of telemetry that comes back. And so that when the general public finally receives that piece of software, it's been tested manually, it's been tested automatically, it's been kind of crowd tested by unwitting customers who are participating in this thing just because they're using a piece of software that is free and has huge values. Most companies who are doing most kinds of software development will never have those kinds of advantages. And so what the crowd is, and this is, I think, where the future of it is as well, the crowd is sort of a proxy for all of those customers that you have who you can't deputize as testers because your business doesn't let you. And I think that's an important thing to remember whenever you read a lot of the hoopla about what DevOps is and what it means, is that ultimately all of this is about your customer. And if you can find a reasonably good proxy for your customer base who can do the kinds of things with your software that your customer base is going to do when it's in production for all of them, that's a great use for crowd testing.
Great, thanks, Phil. Before we go, I just want to throw it back to you and Fernando for one final thought or key takeaway you'd like to leave with our attendees with today.
Well, on my part, I think I've mentioned it before. Yeah, give it a shot. Try again, and it's a new technology, and it's super exciting to be part of it, and it's kind of groundbreaking in the way you think about how you can interact with your development team and your testing team. So give it a shot.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you again, Philip and Fernando, for a great presentation. That was Philip, Software CEO of Testio, and Fernando Gonzalez, Software Test Team Leader for UITV. And I'd like to thank Testio and UITV for sponsoring today's webinar, as well as the attendees for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Christina Cardoza with SD Time.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Fernando. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Bye.